I've been receiving more questions than usual lately, asking me about my background. I guess all of this talk about plants and magic and ancestry doesn't really satisfy the desire to know more about who I am as a person and how I came to talk about these things. And so this coincides really nicely with the work I've been doing in my own personal growth around not bracing against intimacy and vulnerability. So I'm going to practice what I'm being encouraged to practice today by telling you more of the details about who I am and how I came to talk about these things and to think about these things and to care about these things. On this podcast, I've already spoken extensively about my ancestry, the diaspora of European immigration to the United States from Scotland and Ireland and Wales and England and Germany, and that my people came here to South Central Pennsylvania, answering an invitation from William Penn, who wanted to have this experiment of a colony of people united by love and inclusivity and peace. What would happen if they were our foundational tenets? We come together in peace, in inclusion, in love, and without exiling people for their beliefs. So that was the promise of Pennsylvania, the Penn's Woods, the state that started as a colony that my ancestors came to settle in. And so I come from a line of people who were seeking refuge, sanctuary for being different, and who believed that love was the answer. And there is still a deeply progressive and loving and inclusive heart to Pennsylvania and other things. But anyway, I said I would be more personal with this episode. I'm really going to try. So like many people in this state, I grew up really connected to my extended family. I had dozens of cousins. My grandparents lived right next door or right up the hill pretty much my whole young life. I was surrounded by my people. I was one of many. And that lends itself to a huge amount of support and a huge amount of conflict, which I think most people in the Pennsylvania Dutch culture will tell you. Our communities are tight-knit, enmeshed, and abusive because we have all of these patterns of psychological and physical control to keep the relationships close-knit, and my family was no exception. But the amount of support that we experienced cannot be underestimated. It gave us a leg up. We had people who had our backs. We were never alone. If there was a challenge or a setback, there were people to come and help. And there is something that really builds resilience about that. And I did experience that, and I continue to experience that in my adult life. And my children continue to experience that. Both the trauma and the bullying that comes from having a huge extended family, and also the love and resilience that comes from a huge extended family. When I was a child, I did not put a lot of energy or priority into human relationships. My relationships were with the animal and natural world. So whereas my siblings may have memories of people and how people are connected to each other in our community, who's related to who married who's working where, I don't have those pieces of knowledge. I remember plants that were growing, where the birds were nesting, what was living in the stream. I have always had an ecological consciousness. It is the way I'm made, which is not better or worse than the way my siblings are made, because their knowledge of human relationships is vital and has been hugely helpful to me in my life, just as I hope my knowledge of ecological relationships has been helpful to them. But all of my life, I've known that I was here to help the trees, to help the animals, to help other people. That has been part of my experience always. And as a young person who is not following society's rules because I didn't understand them, I was much more interested in what birds were calling to me on the playground than the people and their social dynamics. I was horribly bullied most of 6th and 7th grade. I had death threats. People were extremely unkind to me. I felt a lot of danger. I went to my adults for help, and they told me boys will be boys. I needed a thicker skin, and just ignore them, Erin. This is just how it is on Earth, basically, was the message I received. This is how life is on Earth. More reason to turn away from humans and turn toward the plants and animals, which is exactly what I did. Throughout high school, we moved after some really, really significant family trauma. We moved to a different area, different school system. I made different friends, much healthier friends. I did not experience the bullying in high school that I did when I was younger. I had a very small, tight-knit group of friends who felt like my nuclear family. They had my back no matter what, and they harassed me endlessly, but mostly from a place of love. And one of those people I went on to marry and have children with, who is my husband now. But during that whole time of high school, I was sure I was going to spend my life devoted to animals and helping animals. And so I worked in a veterinary hospital starting when I was 14. I assisted in surgery. I assisted in euthanasias. I was in it. I wanted all of the experiences of what it meant to be a veterinarian and to be an animal care provider. I worked as many evenings as I could. I worked every weekend. I loved veterinary medicine. I also had a second job as a pet shop employee, taking care of puppies and birds and fish. I just wanted to be with animals as much as I could. And so I did that all through high school. And then I went to college, and I majored in biology with a pre-vet or pre-med tract. My plan was to go to veterinary school. And I worked at a pet store and a veterinary office at college. I kept that theme going. And every chance I got, I went out to the woods behind campus. I had this little stone by the stream that had a perfect little cup the shape of my bum. And I would sit there and just watch the water and contemplate life and continue learning from nature, even while I learned from humans and the way of humans helping animals through biology and my pre-veterinary tract. And then my grandfather died while I was a sophomore in college. And in the same week, 9/11 happened here. The terrorist attack in New York City happened the same week, 4 days away from my grandfather's death. And I felt the ripples of that through my whole being, that I had not been focusing on humans. I'd been focusing on animals and streams and plants. And all the while, humans were the sickest of us all. My grandfather's death was without dignity. He did not receive the care that I strive to give to animals in the nursing home where he spent his last weeks. And there was no grief care for my grandmother and my aunts and uncles and my mom. I was so horrified at the lack of support and care for humans and this terrorist attack that proved how humans see life as insignificant. And so I changed my major and I decided to tend to humans. I left the college where I had been going, and I started new training to be a nurse at another college. I left my partner behind. We had gone to the same college to be together, but this calling was so clear, like a bell ringing in my mind. I can't devote my life to animals when humans are so dangerous. And so I became a nurse. And I did the same thing I did in veterinary medicine. I wanted all of the experiences. I worked in the emergency department. I worked in hospice. I wanted to understand life and death coming and going in the same way I did for animals, but now for humans, we are animals. So a lot of it was the same. A lot of the medicines are the same. A lot of the procedures are the same. A lot of the imaging is the same. So I was just sort of fine-tuning my learning as it relates to one mammal instead of the vast learning I was doing before about multiple mammals and reptiles and birds. So in some ways it was almost easier, except that the human mind makes things so complicated. Animals are simple. They are what they are. Humans are not simple. And so through nursing, I became incredibly intimate with the human mind and the human heart. And I started to understand much more deeply why we are so dangerous. And it's because we're so afraid. And as I became more attuned to this deep fear through my work in hospice, especially, people are really afraid to die. And people are also really afraid to lose their loved ones. I needed some support for myself through this process. And so I became really, really spiritual. And during that time, which was the early 2000s, spirituality was New Age. So I studied A Course in Miracles. I read everything I could by Wayne Dyer and Doreen Virtue. I studied all the Eastern traditions, yoga. I was hungry. I was doing everything I could to try to understand a more transcendent mindset in the midst of so much suffering. I loved Ram Dass. These were the teachers that I surrounded myself with at that time, which led me down a path of a huge amount of spiritual bypassing. And so I believed that I was sort of like vibrating at this higher level, almost like of enlightenment. And I was looking down my nose at these humans who I never really identified with. Humans have always been a mystery to me. I feel much more like an animal or a plant. And this New Age spirituality amplified that 1,000%. So here I am, bathed in love and bliss, putting on the mind of Christ. I was really into Christ consciousness at that time. And just sort of beaming out love everywhere I went, seeing myself as a vessel for love, a channel for love, which is beautiful. And it led to a huge amount of overlooking things that were happening in my life that were really dangerous. But I explained it away, oh, I'm not going to engage in that negative thinking. I'm not going to engage in, I'm not going to participate in that way of being in the world. I am love, and I am just going to give love everywhere, which turned out to be a disaster. I did also have a root in Wicca. I became a Wiccan priestess when I was just like 18, right out of high school. My first year of college, I was hungry for spirituality, even then, and a really earthy spirituality, because I was identified as a plant person and an animal person. And so I found Wicca and joined a coven, and that was incredibly life-giving to me. But I left that during this trauma when I went away from animals and towards humans, and that's when I got really deeply into New Age spirituality. I also, during my time in hospice, became familiar with a practice called spiritual direction. I was giving Reiki to patients and staff, and we had a Reiki program that we started in the hospice. I was acting as the executive director at that time. And one of our Reiki volunteers was telling me about this training she had done as a spiritual director. And I just felt it in my body. This is something for me. I want this. And this is right for me. And so I went and applied to the spiritual director training program that she had gone through. And I explained to them that I was not Christian. I didn't identify as Christian. It was a Christian-based program. It's called Oasis Ministries in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania. But they invited me to join anyway, and I did. And in those 2 years, my life completely changed. Again, I had this huge change in September of 2001. And then this was 2010 to 2012. My life completely changed again. I deeply identified with the mystical practices that I found through my spiritual director training. And I encountered a field of presence that was deeply real, that felt animal and human. And synthesis started to happen inside of me, and integration, where I fell from the realm of the transcendent bypassing spirituality of the New Age. And I was sort of caught by the mystics who lived lives that were radically inclusive of pain and suffering. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, Julian of Norwich, Hildegard von Bingen. These were our guides through our spiritual direction training. And not only did I find a deeply and radically real spirituality, I also found Christianity again in a way that was deeply real. And Jesus himself became central as a guide for me during that time, coming to me during vision, as a vision during meditation. He was a tangibly real presence for me. And he also was deeply human. He suffered, he wanted things, he bled, he died, which was something I was really interested in understanding. I wanted to understand death so badly. I've talked about this on this podcast before, where my grandmother died when I was 7, and I really tried to follow her into death. And in that experience, I encountered Hecate, who became a guide for me, and really helped me understand death. And Jesus did too. He really helped me understand death in a way I had not understood it before. And the idea of living through dying. And during that time, I discovered herbalism. One of the women in my cohort did plant walks, and she took us all on a plant walk, and I found another layer of the natural world that I did not understand before. This layer of the connection between plants and humans through folklore and medicine and clothing. And that I realized we had this really deep relationship, plants and humans, that had been kept from me, that how I felt towards plants was normal. People had felt this way toward plants forever. It was only recently that we had lost this connection. And so that led me into a deep study of herbalism. And then I left Christianity again. As I watched the political turmoil of the past 10 years really take Christianity and weaponize it. And I could not be affiliated with that. I could not be in the field of Christianity that was so weaponized and used to hurt people. And so I left the church officially in the last few years because I just could not identify with that field anymore. And during that time, I rejoined a coven of witches and became an elder priestess. We practiced a collective form of witchcraft where we all just sort of had our own ways of walking. Our elder priestess, high priestess, came from a Dianic tradition. Several of us came from Wiccan traditions. Some were just eclectic hedge witches who had no tradition really, but just sort of an intuition for spirit. And it was beautiful until it wasn't. And we let that go. And that was right around the time I found Druidry. And for the past year, I've been deeply on my path of Druidry. And what's so interesting about Druidry is that it is an amalgamation of my entire path so far. Plants are revered, animals are revered, Christianity is more than welcome in Druidry, witchcraft is more than welcome in Druidry. The ancestors are welcomed into Druidry. So all of these threads of my life that I've cultivated find a home, hugely welcome in Druidry. And so throughout all of this, I've been with the same partner for 25 years, my husband, Mike. We met when we were 15, and he knew at first sight that we would be together always. I didn't. It took some convincing for me. But we have this really beautiful love story. We've had our challenges. We've even been separated for periods of time. But we have grown so much and so deeply together over these 25 years. We have 2 children together. Our oldest is 17. Our youngest is 7. We've, all really in my family, we've done a lot of work to heal our ancestral trauma, our personal trauma, and that work is ongoing forever. But just to answer the question, how did I get this way? I've always been this way. My attunement to nature and spirit is lifelong. I came into this incarnation honoring that as a foundational part of who I am. And I had what I call spiritual privilege in that my family are deeply spiritual people. They're founders of churches. They are exiles from churches because of radical beliefs. I have ancestors who were in an apocalyptic cult on the Wissahickon River in Philadelphia, the first wave of ancestors here in 1708, who believed that they had the Philosopher's Stone and were really into astrology. So I have, many, many generations behind me of truth seekers, mystics, anarchists, and deeply patriotic ancestors too, who were part of the Revolutionary War and the Civil War and World War II. And another big part of what I feel like is privilege for me is all of the history I'm privy to, that I know the stories of my people because we've been in one place for so long, 300 years. which gives me a depth of understanding of who we are in the fabric of time and in place. Like, we have belonged to these foothills of the Appalachian Mountains for 300 years. So we know who we are and where we belong, which is something a lot of people don't have access to anymore, and can also be a huge hindrance to growth because there's so much holding of old patterns because they're so entrenched. So I've trained as many things: a nurse, an herbalist, a Reiki master, a spiritual director, a yoga teacher. I left that one out. I became a yoga teacher in 2017. So there's just, I've been seeking my whole life to make sense of this place, what it means to be human, why are humans so dangerous, what are our gifts? Sorry if you can hear Mac in the background. What is the promise of being human? And I continue on that path today. And I thank you for joining me and listening to these musings. It's been such a deep alchemization and amalgamation of study and care and longing over all these years. And I'm ripening. I can tell that it's time for me to share what I've learned more openly, even though that's really, really scary. So thank you for being here for it.